Welcome to a lesson on English literature. Today we are going to discuss studying a fiction. We all read fictions, but there's a vast difference between studying a fiction and reading a fiction. So first we have to decide what is meant by a fiction. A fiction is a built-up story. A built-up story. So the incident in the fiction are the things created by a writer. In Sinhala you call it prabandha, gotapu katawa, right? So generally we read it for our entertainment. But here what we are going to discuss is how to study a fiction properly. Because in the anthology, in your syllabus, you have to study a fiction. All the fictions, they have an abrupt opening. The opening of a fiction is abrupt. That means a sudden opening. No background details are given. But when you think of other stories, I mean folk tales or fairy tales, the background details are given. For example, almost all the Sinhala folk tales begin something like this. Ekamat eka rataka. Raja kenek hitiya. So certain details are given. The characters are introduced. The location is given. So the reader can easily understand the content of the story. But when it comes to a fiction, they have abrupt openings, no background details are given. Because of that, we have to find out, as we are studying the fiction, we have to find out and clarify all these background details. That's what we are going to discuss today. So when you think of finding the background details, there are certain important features which are very, very important. First one is the exposition. The exposition means through this we have to find out certain background details relevant to the story. Under this, the first thing would be the location. Here the location means the place the incident in the story takes place. That's where the story happens. Right? කතාවේ තියෙන සිද්ධවීම් වෙන තැන කොහෙද? මොකද මේක කතාවට තේරුම් ගන්න it's very important. The reason is most of when you think of the incident in a fiction, they are possible incidents. They are possible incidents වෙන්න පුළුවන් දේවල්. So the location should be very clear to understand the content of the story. The second thing is the time period. The time period means, I mean the time duration in which these incidents take place. Now, for example, you have to study the fiction, The Vendor of Sweets. If I am to give you an example, Vendor of Sweets කියන novel එක ඔයගොල්ලෝ study කරද්දි මේකේ time duration එක දැන් location is of course very clear. It happens in Malgudi, a typical South Indian village. Location එක අපි දන්නවා. Time period එක ගැන හිතුවොතින් you have to think this way. I mean the duration. When you consider time duration, මේක පටන් ගන්නවා early 1940s වල ඉඳලා 1960s ඉවර වෙනකම්. මොකද ඒකෙදි ඔයාලා දන්නවා Jagan participated in the Indian freedom struggle. So ඒක වුණේ before 1947. Right? And Mali was in America when John F. Kennedy was killed. ඒක වෙන්නේ in 1963 වල. So මේ time period එක you have to have a clear idea. මොකද මේ authentic details එක story එක link කරලා තියෙනවා the writer. That's a very special feature. The third one is the characters. The characters of the story are really important. we continue reading the story because we want to see what happens to these characters, right? So you have to have a good understanding of the characters in a story. So generally when you think of a fiction, there are two types of characters. There are two types of characters, major characters and minor characters. Major characters means the main characters, right? In Sinhala you call them pradhana charita, and minor characters sulu charita. The difference is the major characters change the story. The story changes because of the decisions taken by the main characters. The minor characters cannot do something like that. They just support the main characters. So towards the end of the story, we focus our attention to see what happens to these characters, right? And the fourth one is cultural or religious background. That is also very important because now when you think of the nature of the characters, now for example, Jagan pretends that he is a devoted Hindu, and the cultural background, I mean, he is against British people, right? So these details help us to have, especially the cultural and religious background, it helps us to have a better understanding about the characters, how to understand the characters, which is a very, very important feature when you think of a fiction. The next one is the point of view. The point of view means how the story is presented, how the story is narrated. Here you find two different styles. They are first person narration and third person narration. In first person narration, you find a character, I mean, probably the main character is telling the story. The narrator in the story is a character. One very good example is most of you read Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes books. So there in these stories, the narrator or the person who tells us the story is Dr. John Watson, and he's a character in the story. He tells using the first person language, I, we, right? So there are advantages and disadvantages of both these. And third person narration means some outsider. We don't know who that person is. He knows everything. He knows about all the characters, and he can describe the things at two places at the same time, and he tells us the story, right? So if it is first person narration, the speaker gives his own experience. He describes his own experience, and one disadvantage is he cannot describe things which are unknown to him, right? So in such occasions, ඒගොල්ලෝ මොකද කරන්නේ? Maybe a letter, maybe a news article, ඒ වගේ ඒ තොරතුරු ටික ගන්න. හරි? But third person narration එකේදී the narrator knows everything. එයා හැම දෙයක්ම දන්නවා, හැමතැනම වෙන දේ දන්නවා, හැම character එකක්ම ගැන දන්නවා. He smoothly tells us the story. Third person narration එකේදී තියෙන advantage එකක් තමයි view එක impartial. බොහොම අපක්ෂපාතීව එයා ලියන්නේ. I'll tell you one good example again related to your prescribed novel, The Vendor of Sweets. මේකේ තියෙන්නේ a conflict between father and son, Jagan and Mali. So මෙතෙන්දී first person narration එකක් ආවා නම් either Jagan or Mali should tell the story. So එහෙම වෙනකොට මෙතන conflict එකක් නිසා එහෙම වුණොත් he talks of his, I mean, for his benefits. Narrator එයාට වාසි වෙන විදිහටයි කතාව කියන්නේ. But when it comes to third person narration, he describes both positive and negative qualities of these characters. An impartial, natural view is given. So that's very important. So before studying the fiction, we should have a clear idea of these things. If I am to summarize them again, we have to expose these details. Okay, the location, the place where the story take place, the time period during which this incidents take place, and the characters we have to identify, the main characters or major characters and minor characters, and the cultural and religious background which helps to develop the characters, and the point of view, how the story is presented, whether it is a first person narration or a third person narration. So if we have an understanding of these things, it really helps us to study the fiction well. දැන් මෙතන මම කලිනුත් කියවනේ මේ නවකතාව අපි කියවනවා නෙමෙයි ස්ටඩි කරනවා. මේක අධ්‍යයනයක් අපි කරන්නේ. ඒතකොට මේ දේවල් අපි දන්නවා නම් that will be really helpful to you. Okay? Then here exposition I took as the first one. The second one is the conflict. A conflict means kind of a problem. The story is based and is developed on that conflict. ගැටුමක් අර්බුදයක් තියෙනවා. ඒ ගැන තමයි මේ කතාව දිගටම ගෙනියන්නේ. Very simply අපි කතා කරොත් again the vendor of sweets, the conflict is the dispute between Jagan and Mali, the problem between father and son. Right? ඒ දෙන්න අතර තියෙන පොඩි මත ගැටුමක්. ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ attitudes venas, ආකල්ප venas, the way they think, හිතන විදිය, qualities, characteristics, behavior patterns, all these are different. So the conflict is that. Story එකෙන් කියවෙන්නේ මේ conflict එක ගැන. Okay? Then you have to find out the climax of a story. The climax means a peak point. Right? It is a place where the story changes. Now when you think of a short story, there is only one climax, or the turning point you can call it. But when you think of a fiction, there can be several turning points. Right? If we took examples, Ambiga's death is a turning point in the story. After Ambiga's death, the conflict between Jagan and Mali begins. Second, another one, Mali stopped schooling. He stopped his studying. That is another turning point in the story. Mali goes to America. Another climax, another turning point. He returns with Grace, a Korean American girl. Another turning point in the story. The story changes there. Jagan's behavior, all the things. And Jagan decides to leave everything and to lead a spiritual, religious life. These are turning points in the story. Right? The fourth one would be, we call it falling action. Falling action means how this conflict settles. Falling action means how this conflict settles. There are two possible ways. මේ conflict එක settle වෙන දේවල් ක්‍රම දෙකක් තියෙනවා. එකක් තමයි the positive way or the negative one. ඒක අනුව තමයි depend වෙන්නේ. ඒක අනුව තමයි තීරණය වෙන්නේ the end of the story. Right? So the problem settles. Either they come to settlement, then there will be a happy ending, or the dispute continues, something negative can happen. And the fifth one is resolution. Resolution is the end of the story. There we find what happens to the characters. Now when you think of this thing, the vendor of sweets, it has an open end. දැන් එතනදී Jagan died and Mali took over the business කියලා ඉවර කරා නම් it's a close end, right? But this particular story has an open end. That means the reader is given to think of different possibilities. Reader හිතන්න පුළුවන් වෙන ගොඩක් දේවල් නේ. Jagan religious life එකක් ගත කරලා අපව වෙන්න පුළුවන් ටික දවසක. Mali will go to prison and he will come out as a good man and take over the business like a good businessman. Until then the cousin will look after the business, right? So when you think of this particular novel, it has an open end. The reader can think different things, different views we can have, right? We can assume things. හිතන්න පුළුවන්. Jagan මෙහෙම කරයි, Mali මෙහෙම කරයි, this thing like this. So once again, if we think of these facts, අපි මේ කතා කරපු මේ කරුණු ටික ගැන අපිට අවබෝධයක් තියෙනවා නම් අර මං කලින් කියපු එක ස්ටෝරි එක ස්ටඩි කරන්න. නැත්තම් මේ නවකතාව අධ්‍යයනය කරන්න අපිට මේක ලොකු පහසුවක් වෙනවා. හරි? So දැන් අපි අපේ නවල් එකට මේක රිලේට් කරොතින් ආපහු සැරයක් ලොකේෂන් එක මල්ගොඩි, a South Indian village. හරි? ඒතර ඉන්දියාවේ මිනිස්සු ගැන තමයි කතා කරන්නේ. The time period මං කලින් කිව්වා වගේ 1940s, early 40s ඉඳලා late 60s. ඒ කාල පරාසය තුළ තමයි මේ සිද්ධිය වෙන්නේ. Characters, major characters, Jagan and Mali. Major characters, Jagan and Mali. There are some other minor characters like the cousin, Sivaraman, the lawyer, Natraj, the printer, ඒ වගේ අය. The cultural and religious background. Culture එකේ conflict එකක් වෙනවා. මොකද Jagan traditional Indian කෙනෙක්, Mali appreciates Western things. But religious background එක වෙන්නේ Jagan is a devoted Hindu. Hindu background එක යන්නේ. Hindu දෙවිවරු ගැන කතා කරන්නේ. The point of view එක third person narration එකක්. ඒක නිසා මේක අපිට දෙනවා impartial view එකක්. බොහොම අපක්ෂපාතීව. Jagan ගෙත් හොඳ සහ නරක දෙකම කතා කරනවා. Mali is the same. Then when you think of the conflict, surface එකෙන් අපි දකින්නේ the conflict between the father and son. Generation gap එකක්. Universal theme එකක්. Right? එතකොට මෙතෙන්දී basically, as I told you, the conflict between the father and son, when we extend that, the conflict between the two generations, the older generation and the younger generation. And if you further analyze, තව ටිකක් එහාට analyze කරොත් මේකේ තියෙනවා the Western culture versus traditional Indian culture. ඒ දෙක අතරත් වෙනසක් පෙන්වනවා මෙතන. Right? So that is the conflict. And the climax, as I told you, the turning points in the story, there can be many. Right? Ambiga's death, for example. And folding action means how the conflict settles. The make of Jagan's decision after he met the bearded man, he decides to lead a spiritual life. He decided to give up his business, old bonds, relationships, and he's going to start a different type of a life. If I am to live anymore, it would be on different planes. Right? So that's how it happens. And on the other hand, when you think of Mali, he a very cunning person. So whatever it is, he is arrested by the police for an offense. Still we don't know. Perhaps he might be sent into the prison. He will be imprisoned. I mean, a certain period in prison will help him to mold his life. So after that, there's a possibility that he becomes a good man. And the end of the story, the resolution, it has an open end, as I told you. The narrator stops at a particular place, giving the readers different possibilities to assume. අපිට හිතන්න ගොඩක් දේවල් දීලා එයා ස්ටෝරි එක නවත්තනවා. හරි? අපිට පුළුවන් තව එහාට හිතන්න Jagan would do something like this, Mali would do something like this. ඒ වගේ අපිට කරන්න පුළුවන්. දැන් මේ background knowledge එකත් එක්ක, right? දැන් මේ මම මුලින් කතා කරපු මෙන්න මේ background knowledge එකත් එක්ක අපිට බොහොම පහසුයි මේ ස්ටෝරි එක ස්ටඩි කරන්න. මොකද අපි දන්නවා the background, right? Geographical background එක, time period එක, all these things ඒ දැනුමත් එක්ක අපි ස්ටෝරි එක ස්ටඩි කරන්න පටන් ගත්තාම අපිට අපේ ටාගට්ස් වලට යන්න පුළුවන්. So this background knowledge really helps you to study any fiction. So with that, we are going to conclude our lesson, and then in the next lesson we will discuss another separate section of this interesting subject, literature. Thank you.